Hey everyone, welcome back to Falcons Central Radio Show on the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I'm Aaron Freeman, founder of FalFans.com. I'm joined by my good friend Scott Karasik, who's writing over at sportsnot.com. We are back this week, coming off the 4th of July. We're going to recap a little bit of what we did over the holiday weekend. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the recent news going on with the Falcons, and we'll do our positional preview this week. We'll be discussing wide receivers and tight ends. And as usual, we'll be answering all you guys' mailbag questions at the end of the show and throughout the middle of the show. So, Scott, let's kick things off. We just had a holiday. What'd you get into this weekend?
I got into sleeping on the couch and hanging out with a girlfriend's family. So not much, really. How about you, Aaron?
It was a relaxing weekend. My brother did some grilling yesterday, and we went to go check out some fireworks with my nieces. So, it was pretty a chill weekend, and that's about it.
So, yeah. I mean, one thing that I do like about the 4th of July is that it kind of unites people, even for a day.
For a day, yeah.
For a day in an election year, for the most part. I do want to do a quick shout out to the people that actually fought for this country, because that job is not easy, and it kind of sucks, honestly, having to shoot at people, get shot at, and it's a sacrifice not just for the troops but for their families. So I do want to say thank you to all the people that have fought for this country. And on that note, I mean, I do want to do a quick shout out. A friend of mine just started working there at the PTSD Foundation, and just wanted to get some, I guess you'd say, like, publicity out there about what they do. They basically help fund veterans and like the psychologists that they can go see to get help with their PTSD. So it's ptsdusa.org. Just go there. If you want to donate a little bit, go for it, but at least just check the website out and see what they're doing. And spread the message. If you know a veteran that you think might be dealing with it, just send them the site, let them know. The goal of the site is basically to provide free or super low cost psychiatric help for those that do suffer from PTSD.
Yeah, it's a good cause. Anything that really supports our veterans, because I think there's a lot of people out there like your friend and this organization that do a lot of good work with veterans. But I think generally in this country, we haven't really done a great job supporting our veterans that have been coming home from all the wars that we've been fighting over the last, decade plus. So it is one of those things where people, do what you can to support the veterans and those that do make it back, as well as honor those that didn't get the opportunity to make it back and their sacrifices. But on that somber note, let's move on to some bigger and brighter things, Scott. Let's talk about Tyson Jackson. Definitely bigger. We'll find out if it's brighter. But, this is the point in the offseason where there's not a whole lot going on, so we have to find some stuff to talk about. And with Tyson Jackson, the fact that he's training with one of this show's favorite pop stars, Demi Lovato.
I knew you'd appreciate that, Aaron. Life is so
yeah, for those of you guys that are like, what is going on? I guess it was last year, Scott accidentally sent me a link to a Demi Lovato music video that I accidentally linked to the live stream of this show one time. And so that was quite a little bit of an embarrassment instead of watching us talk.
It's still
People
funny.
got to watch a minute of Demi Lovato's video or whatnot. But so if you guys haven't heard, Tyson Jackson, I guess, is training with Demi Lovato or whatnot. They're doing the MMA stuff over, I guess, Jay Glazer's place, wherever that is, and I think it's in LA or whatever. And Scott, you got any takes on Tyson Jackson's workout regime, or maybe you got a take on Demi Lovato's workout regime?
I bet she hits harder than he does.
There you go.
I've seen his lack of punch for years now.
Okay, I got nothing else to say there. Yeah, I mean, sure. Yeah, I got nothing else to add to that. Cookie by Nature asked a question similar on the same line of thinking. He says, "Ask thoughts on Tyson Jackson's haircut and how his body looks now."
His body looks just as fat as it ever has, and his haircut just makes him look like he's got a fat head. I mean, he's a lineman. He's not going to look skinny. He's not going to look small. I mean,
yeah,
he looks kind of like Biggie Langston's big brother. If you ever watch wrestling,
I'm not that up on the current wrestlers. You know, my forte with wrestling is like 89 to like 90, 2001 maybe.
Man,
So.
you would love Enzo Amore and Colin Cassidy, that tag team, and you'd love the New Day because they're just hilarious. They're fun.
I do know the New Day.
Fun right now. The New Day, Big E is one of the members of the New Day.
Oh, okay.
The big guy in the New Day.
He's the big guy. Okay. I didn't know what that guy's name was. Okay. Yeah, I mean, with Tyson Jackson, he looks the same as he always does. You can't really, you know, when you're 320, 330 pounds, it doesn't really, you know, you can lose weight and you can't really tell all that much. Or gain weight, and it's hard to kind of tell. But with his haircut, you know, maybe it streamlines him. Julio cut his hair and he became better, so maybe Tyson Jackson becomes better. I don't know. That's the best I can do, Cookie. So moving on to that, you know, next topic of news: the Falcons are working on their tackling, which is a little bit more pertinent to what's going to happen on the field this year, I would say, than Tyson Jackson's haircut and his MMA training partners. But, you know, I think it was Vaughn McClure wrote a story about how the Falcons were working with the coach of the English national rugby team like this past week or earlier this summer. I can't remember the exact details.
It was they were working with them earlier this summer, it looks like.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, obviously the Falcons are, you know, looking at trying to improve their tackling because they weren't a great tackling team last year. They haven't really been a great tackling team since, I don't know, like 2010 maybe. Was the last time that they were actually a pretty decent tackling team. I can recall them playing like that. So it is one of those things that seems to be something that Quinn and his coaching staff are really emphasizing, better tackling technique. And it looks like a lot of what they're doing this offseason has been, particularly at the linebacker position, was adding speed and athleticism more so than toughness and physicality. And they're basically going to go with the idea, I guess, that they can sort of coach those guys up on their tackling and their toughness and their physicality, which, you know, makes sense from the perspective that people always say you can't really coach speed, but maybe you can coach tackling. And bringing in this rugby guy, because rugby people, by and large, are much better tacklers than football players. And, you know, there's a lot of reasons for that because they don't wear pads, and so therefore they can't just lower their heads and just try to spear guys or they'll kill themselves. So it is one of those things where hopefully we'll see if it pays off. Are you expecting a pretty good year of tackling improvement from guys like Warlow, Campbell, Weatherspoon, Jones, those types of players who aren't exactly known for being great tacklers?
I mean, if this can get them from missing 10 to missing 8, it's worth the investment. Those two tackles a game, and you have how many games the Falcons lost last year by 3 points? So, you know, if those are 2 tackles per guy, per player, that's 1 tackle per game that probably doesn't get missed this year. And it doesn't sound like a lot, but when you lose what, 6 games by 3 points or less, like they did last year, it adds up.
Yeah, I mean, if those tackles are the difference between getting a stop on 3rd and 8 versus not getting a stop on 3rd and 8, that makes a difference. It won't suddenly, completely change the fortunes of the Falcons season, but it could affect one or two games, the outcome of one or two games. Like, imagine if the Falcons tackled Jameis Winston last year on that infamous run where he, on what was it, 3rd and 17, he ran for 20 yards, or 3rd and 19, he ran for 20 yards. So, that's potentially a game where the Falcons win if they can tackle him on that one play. So, any improvement, even if it's a 5 or 10% improvement, that's 5%, 10% worthwhile investment, I guess. Now, speaking of tackling, our next news item is about the Falcons talking up Keanu Neal, who is a tackling machine, as they say. And there was quotes from Richard Smith like last week or earlier this week, I can't remember when it was, where he was talking about how impressed he was with Keanu Neal's maturity and his leadership, and basically the Falcons are pretty high on what he can do right away this year as a rookie, which I don't think is a big surprise, because if you look at this draft class, if anybody's has the best chance to impact early with the 16 group of players, it's definitely Keanu Neal. I think everybody's pretty much not even penciling him in. I think writing in permanent ink that he's going to be the starting strong safety this year. And I don't think there's really any doubt. Yeah, so I mean, it really was like, really, I haven't heard a single person question whether or not he's going to start. And you like to hear if he's going to be thrust in that situation, as everybody seems to expect. You like to hear things like this, that he's showing early sort of the high character player that he is, which I don't think is a surprise based off of who he was and what he did at Florida. But it is nice to hear, those sort of affirmations from the coaching staff that, he checks all those boxes that you want to see him check. Because, safety is such a position where it really is, a lot of it is a quote unquote neck up position, where if you can handle it from the neck up, it can take care of a lot of things from the neck down. More so than a lot of other defensive positions, where it really is kind of about, who's biggest, fastest, and strongest. But safety is one of those positions, and I think Neal has what it takes to be a really good player. What are your thoughts on the Falcons coaching staff and what you expect from Neal year one?
I mean, I love Keanu Neal. I didn't think that he was worth that first-round pick, but again, he was taken. I just kind of have to suck it up. I didn't think Bruce Irvin was worth a first-round pick when he went 15th overall in 2012 either. So if they see a role for him and they like him and he's mature and off the field, he's basically William Moore, that leader in the locker room and that defensive captain, the much-needed leadership that we do need in the defense this year. I mean, I like him. I do have some questions regarding his game, but, if Dan Quinn loves how he's playing and they love his fit, and it's not like the strong safety role in this scheme was that crazy of a role last year. It was primarily like man-on-man with tight ends, underneath zones, rare blitz here and there, but for the most part, just that underneath robber zone, right over the middle, every single play. So.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned William Moore, and I know there is a contingent of Falcon fans that think William Moore stinks, but I think it's interesting that you made that comparison with William Moore. When William Moore came out, he was one of my favorite players in that 2009 draft class. And I feel like Keanu Neal, when I was writing my scouting report, basically I said his floor is Jonathan Cyprien and his ceiling is Cam Chancellor. And I'm the type of person that I sort of usually, when I'm evaluating players, I like look at their floor and look at their ceiling, and then what I think the player I compare them to is the guy who's between those 2 points. And I think William Moore is a good comparison for that because I do feel like he's somewhere between Cam Chancellor and Jonathan Cyprien in this scheme, or at least in his prime had he been able to play in this scheme. And I feel like that's the type of player that Keanu Neal should be able to turn into. And, despite, people's sort of, at least in my eyes, revisionist history that William Moore wasn't a good player, I do feel like his stint in Atlanta from 2010 to 2013, so his prime years, he was really one of the better players on our defense, and I think he really had an impact on the field. I don't expect Keanu Neal to have like the Cam Chancellor level of impact where he's just a dominant player, every Sunday. But I do feel like William Moore, there's going to be 4 or 5 Sundays where he's going to definitely make his impact on the football field, both as a run defender and maybe in coverage. And, I'm really looking forward to seeing whether or how quickly if Neal can sort of hit that benchmark. If it happens year 1, or is it, you might have to wait a little bit to 2017. But, that'll be what plays out this year. Now, we got a question about Keanu Neal from Leovani Lasada. He asked, does Neal's tackling worry you? After watching tons of tape, he makes some pretty bad reads.
I don't really think it's the reads that's the issue. The thing about Neal that worries me is that he's more of a headhunter. So I kind of see a lot of the William Moore, like, going after guys up high. That's what kind of worries me. But if he can keep his tackling and his head down, I think he'll be fine.
Yeah. I think you're right, Scott. I think you nailed it pretty much. I think his issue isn't necessarily because he makes bad reads or he's bad instinctual. I think he's got very good instincts. I just think he gets a little bit over aggressive, looking for the knockout blow, and it causes him to make some mistakes, which I think if, at least from my book, if that's what you got to worry about, then I can live with that. I can live with a guy who's a little bit too aggressive, who's, that's not really a big issue to me. He'll miss tackles. Don't get me wrong. Like, he's going to miss tackles, just like William Moore missed tackles. But I think overall, it's not going to be a major concern long term. Okay, so let's move on to the big part of the show, which is our positional preview. If you checked out last week's episode, we broke down quarterbacks and running backs. On our next show, which will probably be in 2 weeks, we will break down the offensive linemen. And as we do, we just kind of go through, see what some of the major storylines and camp battles are going into training camp and some of our expectations for the upcoming season. And we'll start things off with the wide receivers. A bunch of guys on the roster, a lot more competition at this position than I think we're used to in some of the recent years, particularly under the Mike Smith regime, where it was pretty much the same 4 or 5 guys that were pretty much locked into spots. This year, we have Julio Jones, Mohamed Sanu, Justin Hardy. I think everybody agrees those guys are locks, but then you have a bunch of other guys that are all going to be competing for spots, including Devin Hester, Eric Weems, Aldrick Robinson, Nick Williams, the rookie 7th-round pick Devin Fuller, David Glennon, Dajay Johnson, Jordan Leslie, and J.D. McKissick. C.J. Goodwin would have been on this list, but he, of course, got moved to cornerback. So that's one less. That's a little bit less of a glut there. So, Scott, what do you think of the key camp battles heading into training camp at the end of the month?
I mean, I think that slot receiver Justin Hardy's got the lead on it, and I don't think you're going to see him get cut. But I do think it's not his job locked in as that slot receiver just yet, or even as that number 3 receiver just yet. So you could see, I don't know, Nick Williams, Dajay Johnson, Aldrick Robinson, all 3 of those guys kind of give him a run for his money, depending on how he's getting used in the early on. I really like Hardy. I thought he was an underrated receiver last year, but he was a rookie. He'd never played with a playbook until being a pro, which that's kind of rare. But I do think slot receiver is the biggest battle. And then after that, it's just the final spots. Do they keep 5? Do they keep 6? Do they keep 7? Who do they keep? You got Julio, Sanu, and Hardy. Do they cut Hester? Do they cut Robinson? What kind of guys are they going to keep? Do they keep Dajay Johnson if he looks like a great returner and cut Hester? They might not even keep Devin Fuller. They cut their 7th-round pick last year. So that means Devin Fuller's not even safe. If Nick Williams can out Eric Weems, then he'll be the one that keeps that roster spot. I think the last couple of spots, you basically got 3 different types of guys that are going to fight for each other, fight for their role. I think you got Eric Weems, Nick Williams, and David Glidden for one of those spots. I think you got Devin Hester, Devin Fuller, and Dajay Johnson for a second spot. And I think you got Aldrick Robinson, Jordan Leslie, J.D. McKissick, going for a potential 6th wide receiver. The Falcons would have to get them to ball out and look like amazing wide receivers in order to even say, you know what, let's keep a 6th. Otherwise, there's just going to be a bunch of practice squad bodies. So, if I was picking it today, I think it'd be Julio Jones, Mohamed Sanu, Justin Hardy. I think Nick Williams wins that battle with Weems and Glidden. I think Devin Fuller wins the battle against Hester and Dajay Johnson. And I think Aldrick Robinson shows enough to be kept. So you end up with the 6th of Julio, Sanu, Robinson, Hardy, Nick Williams, and then Devin Fuller.
Yeah, no, that's the same 6 I went with when I did my post-draft roster prediction back at the guess that was in the beginning of May. People can check that out on falcons.com. And I feel like we talk about Devin Hester, and just as a preface, I'm a big fan of Devin Hester, but I do feel like the Falcons have made a bunch of moves this offseason that basically signal that they're prepared to move on for Devin Hester, and they're basically looking for a reason to cut him at the end of training camp. I don't think you draft Devin Fuller. You don't draft a return specialist in this day and age, given the rule changes on special teams, really basically eliminating the kickoff from the game. You just don't draft that type of player if you don't plan on keeping him. And so it's really a zero-sum game with Devin Hester and Devin Fuller. And the drafting of Devin Fuller is really a shot across the bow of Devin Hester. Now, Fuller's been dealing with hamstring issues, and hamstring issues are notorious for lingering. They're hard to shake, so that could play a factor into it. I'm not going to sit here and say that Devin Hester is definitely going to get cut, because Devin Hester is Devin Hester. And if he gets an opportunity to reps in training camp and he's healthy, then I'm sure he'll take advantage of those opportunities to look a little bit better than some of these other guys that he's getting pushed by. But it is one of those things where I feel like if it's close, the Falcons will go with a guy like Devin Fuller. I thought it was interesting, Scott, that you mentioned that Hardy doesn't have that slot cornerback spot locked. To me, I guess not necessarily the biggest camp battle. I feel like Hardy is the lock for the 3rd wide receiver spot. To me, I guess my bigger concern is whether or not he's going to be playing more of the slot wide receiver or the Z flanker spot, because I thought it was interesting last summer with the Falcons. I think this contributed to why Justin Hardy was not a significant contributor in the first half of the season. Was last preseason, the Falcons really only played Hardy, so many names going through my head, at the Z spot behind when Roddy White was out of the lineup. And you look at a guy like Mohamed Sanu, who could sort of play that Leonard Hankerson role, which he could play both in the slot and the flanker position. And I do wonder if the Falcons are going to try to have more interchangeable wide receivers so they can move around Julio Jones. They can move around Mohamed Sanu. They can move around Justin Hardy and sort of just have each of those guys be interchangeable. All three of those guys play mix and match in the slot. All three of those guys also play on the outside. And I'm curious to see if that's sort of their plan with both, particularly Hardy and Sanu, because I feel like both of those players – really their skill sets are designed to be more slot guys and outside guys, but you can only really have one guy in the slot at one given time unless you're going to play 4 wide receivers exclusively. So I'm curious to see how that plays out. And that's really not necessarily something that we're going to know about in training camp, but once the regular season happens, how that plays out will be interesting to watch this year with the wide receivers. Now, one player that we don't have a lot of questions about going into the season, or the question isn't whether or not he'll be good, it's how good will he be, and that's Julio Jones. So is it realistic to expect that Julio Jones could be better than what he was last year where he put up monster production? Could he be even possibly better this year?
It's scary to think that he could be. Especially in the red zone. I'm not saying he was bad in the red zone by any means, but now he's not going to get triple teamed in the red zone where the Falcons are saying, hey, we don't want to throw him the ball because there's 3 different people there.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at you compare someone's numbers, like red zone numbers between like Des Bryant and Julio Jones over the last couple of years and sort of how many more opportunities in the red zone that Des Bryant has gotten over that time and how more successful he's been able to convert those opportunities. And, as you say, that's not really a weakness of Julio. There really is no weaknesses of Julio Jones's game, but it is one of those areas of his game that he hasn't really sort of hit his max potential there. And while I don't think anybody should expect Julio Jones to have a better season than what he did last year, it is kind of possible when you think about it, just from the standpoint of there were about 6 weeks of last year where he really wasn't healthy. And you wonder, what would happen if Julio Jones could be healthy for, instead of 10 games, he could be healthy for 12 or 13 or 14 games. Or, dare I say 16 games. And just to see what sort of production he could do if he's not limited. It is possible that he could be better. Now, from my perspective, I sort of expect Sanu to sort of carve into his – I hope Sanu significantly carves into his production. So I think if Julio does have a better season than what he did, I do feel like that's a situation where it's great for Julio, but I don't necessarily know if it's going to be the best thing for the team because I do feel like a big part of what's been missing from this team the last couple of years is having 2 reliable receivers, and that sort of explains or at least hints at my negativity with the Sanu signing, because I feel like people sort of want him and expect him to be like Michael Jenkins when I think he really needs to be more like Tony Gonzalez in the way of how Tony Gonzalez played second fiddle or first fiddle to Roddy White back in the day when the Falcons, back in 2009 and 2010 and whatnot, when the Falcons offense was really clicking with their running game. So I still remain skeptical on whether Sanu can be that guy, but if he is, then the one player that should see the hit in his production is probably going to be Julio Jones. Now he'll still probably wind up being a Pro Bowler and still one of the 3 or 4 most productive receivers in the NFL, but maybe he only gets 110 catches as opposed to 130 catches or something like that. So we'll see how
1,400 yards instead of 1,875.
Yeah, I think the key with Julio is not how many yards and catches he has. It's really more about touchdowns. We need to see him get back into double-digit touchdowns. Like 10, 11, 12 touchdowns is ideal for him.
I love how you listed Des Bryant, because I was going to go in the same direction with why I think Julio doesn't get the touchdowns that he used to. Or not that he used to, but that he could.
Mm-hmm.
I think the big reason why Julio doesn't get the touchdowns that he could is because Atlanta doesn't have the tight end that they used to have when he started out that could get those red zone touchdown catches and at least draw coverages in the red zone. When you don't have a guy who's at least a threat in the red zone the way Tony Gonzalez was, and I'm not saying you got to be as good as Tony Gonzalez, but let's be honest here. Late run Tony Gonzalez was not anywhere close to what he was down in Kansas City. Not anywhere nearly as good as he was in Kansas City. But he was still able to get open in the end zone, use his body as a target, and catch touchdowns. I think at a minimum, Austin Hooper could do that in Atlanta. I think Levine Toilolo, at a minimum, could do that in Atlanta. So I would love to see Atlanta go with these packages where you've got Toilolo and Sanu and Hooper and Jones on the field and run combo routes between the tight ends and the receivers, and whoever gets open gets open. And hope that Ryan has trust in them to catch the ball. Because if Ryan had a tight end he could trust, that makes it even tougher than, say, you got Devontae out the backfield, you got Julio Jones at receiver, and what else is there to cover? That's a big issue that Atlanta had in the red zone last year, was you had Julio and Devontae, and that's all he trusted. And Tammy didn't fight for the ball effectively in the red zone, so Tammy would never get the ball thrown to him in the red zone. If Atlanta had a legitimate red zone tight end, which I think Austin Hooper can be, even as a rookie, I'm not saying he's going to be a 50-catch, 600-yard kind of guy as a rookie, but I think Cooper could at least be a 20-catch, 300-yard kind of guy with a bunch of touchdowns in the red zone, taking some of the catches away from Julio down there, because he'll get open. And just by providing that threat, having 4 or 5 touchdowns from the tight end position in the red zone, that would open things up for Julio to get to that 10, 11, 12 mark that he should easily hit every year.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And sort of that, to me, is the big question with Hooper's impact this year is really the thing that we're going to be counting on him more so than I think him potentially starting over Tammy is, can he impact in the red zone? And while I don't expect him to have some, 7 or 8 touchdown season like Joseph Fourier did have coming off the bench with the Lions a couple of years ago, I do feel like he can sort of give us, 3 or 4 touchdowns in the red zone, which will certainly help, because that's 3 or 4 touchdowns that Jacob Tamme really didn't give us last year. Tamme had 1 red zone touchdown last year. He got like 8 targets in the red zone, only converted 1 of them for a touchdown. And when you look at not just what production the Falcons got out of the tight end position in the red zone under Tony Gonzalez, who converted about 30% of his red zone targets into touchdowns, but you look at the backups, even Toilolo's and the Michael Palmer's of the world back then, they were still converting like 37, I think, 38% of their red zone targets into touchdowns. So that's really the benchmark. You're really hoping that the Falcons can get 1 out of 3 or 3 out of 8 or something like that. And I think that's really what you're looking for with Hooper this year, more so than anything else. And I feel like he has the ability, if he's going to impact quickly, it's going to be that, not necessarily being the reliable third down chain mover that Tony Gonzalez was in his prime, or that I think Tamme can be at times for this offense, or this prolific blocker. I would probably say he's probably the 3rd best blocker on the roster right now at that tight end position, behind Toilolo and Tila Vea. So I don't feel like that's going to be somewhere where he impacts, but I do feel like the red zone is a potential area where he can come in right away if he's utilized correctly by Kyle Shanahan and sort of give us something there, something more than what we've had in some of the recent years since Tony Gonzalez retired. Now, we're talking about the tight end position, and I just talked about Tammy winning that starting job, and you talked a little bit about it, Scott. But let's answer it definitively. Do you feel like Hooper can unseat Tammy for the starting job, or will unseat Tammy for the starting job?
By week 1, I don't know. I don't think so. By the time we get to like week 7, week 8, week 9, I think we'll see Hooper in there enough once he gets comfortable in the scheme and comfortable in the blocking that you'll see Hooper in there more than Tammy just because he's a more willing, he's a bigger body, and I think he's a better blocker. That's not saying that Hooper is an amazing blocker right away, but he shows enough basic technique, he's strong enough, and he shows enough form to where you're like, all right, Hooper's a way better blocker than Jacob Tamme, who's arguably one of the worst blockers at tight end in the NFL. That's all I'm saying there. And I think as a receiver, he may not be as good as Tamme starting out, but I think he's got the same kind of ability now that Tamme has, which when you're looking at two options, and they're about even now, and one's what, 22, 21, 22, and the other is 32, 33, you're going to go with the 22-year-old who's got potential to be up here than the guy whose peak is right here.
Yeah, that's fair.
I think you'll see Hooper towards the end of the year as the starting tight end, the guy who's seeing – he may not see 100% of the snaps, but I think he'll see 65, 70% of the snaps by the time the end of the season rolls around.
Yeah, I don't really disagree with anything you said. So I guess that leaves the question: if we're pretty confident that in some order, Tamme and Hooper are going to be the top 2 guys, what does that leave for what Levine Toilolo is going to be, who at one point in time was, considered the future at that position, but now is basically potentially on the roster bubble? Do you think there's a chance that Toilolo could get cut this year?
I think it's possible. He's not worth the 1.6 or 1.7 million. I forget exactly what his contract number is. That fourth-year contract would suggest. It all depends on what comes down. What Josh Perkins, what DJ T. can do. If T. can be that true number 3 tight end, that blocking talent that Toilolo just never has been, I think he's going to take the spot. Otherwise, they might look more towards a receiver like Perkins. And Perkins is like a Brian Finneran type that actually wants to play tight end and not stick at wide receiver, where he can be that H-back, line up in the backfield, line up in the slot, line up in line, isn't afraid to block, but at the same time, he's big enough to where he's going to attack people. And he's a 6'4", 225-pound guy, and he's got frame to gain a lot more weight. And I think the Falcons could either keep him on the roster and say, you know what, if we're going to have 2 tight ends, it's going to be Tamme and what's his name? Tamme and Hooper, no matter what. But if we're going to go with 3 tight ends, we want a guy who can come in and play kind of an H-back role, can be mobile, can get those underneath touchdowns, can just play special teams a little faster than, say, Toilolo or even Tia can. So I think if they did go with someone else, I think it'd be Perkins over Tia. But at the same time, I don't see them going away from Toilolo just yet.
Yeah, no, I think that's going to be one thing to watch this year. I agree with you. I think Toilolo could be on the roster bubble. I think he's going to have to actually earn a roster spot. He's not going to be getting it this year. I think he'll probably wind up winning it. But I did see some things from Tia last summer that I thought, okay, he could actually be better at Toilolo than the things that they're going to really ask Toilolo to be, which is to play special teams and block. Vea unfortunately got injured in that Ravens preseason game last summer at the preseason finale last year. But he was really killing it on special teams. And Toilolo always sort of is on the punt coverage units, but he's never really been a good player on that. He just kind of is taking up space more so than anything, being a great coverage guy. And I do feel like Toilolo's blocking is not bad. It's not poor or anything like that, but it's not spectacular to the degree that you're like, oh, yeah, he's an amazing blocker, to the point that he's, hands down going to win that spot. And I do feel like Vea can show some things a little bit as a blocker. So it's really whether or not if Vea can be that guy that he was in that Ravens game throughout this entire summer. There's a chance that he could steal that job from Toilolo just because, as Scott said, that that salary cap, he hit an escalator or something, and yeah, his cap hit is like $1.75 million this year, and the Falcons could save pretty much all of it if they cut him before, the start of the season, which isn't cap space that they necessarily need, but if you can basically carry over an extra $1.75 million into next year's salary cap, why not? Especially if you think you can get, if Vea can be 80% as good or 100% as good as Toilolo for, maybe 30% the price, why not? So, I do feel like that last tight end spot is really going to be a battle between those two guys, with Toilolo likely to win it, but it wouldn't shock me if Vea upsets him. Perkins, on the other hand, I do like Josh Perkins, and I feel like he has some developmental upside. I don't necessarily see him winning a starting job or a roster spot year one, but I do feel like he's a potentially prime candidate to be on the practice squad and sort of be groomed to replace Tammy, who is a free agent next year. And sort of he can just kind of slide potentially into that spot down the road behind Hooper that we sort of expect Tammy to be playing by year's end. And he could do that job reasonably well. So we'll have to see how it plays out in training camp and in the preseason. All right, Scott, you got anything else to add on the wide receiver and tight end positions before we move on to the mailbag questions?
Not really. I mean, I think it's a pretty straightforward show this week because wide receiver and tight end are pretty straightforward spots for the Falcons this year.
Yeah. And hopefully we won't get some of the issues the Falcons have dealt with in the last few summers has been really bad backup quarterback play, so we haven't really been getting the opportunities to really see what some of these second and third string wide receivers and tight ends can do. And hopefully maybe there's a chance that comes to an end if you want to buy Matt Schaub stock this year. So that'll be something to look forward to, that we might see some of these guys step up and play a little bit better because our quarterback play isn't so atrocious. But let's get into the mailbag questions. Our first question comes from Vienna Falcons, all the way from Austria. He says, I looked up Deion Buchanan's measurables, and I was surprised at how similar to Deion Jones they are. Could Quinn be molding his own money backer? Maybe the Jones pick is a head scratcher. Head scratcher. Yeah, head scratcher. Because the position was invented just a few months ago.
All right. Aaron's speech impediment aside. I mean, I think it wasn't that much of a head scratcher. Honestly, Atlanta needed an inside linebacker. Deion Jones played inside linebacker at LSU. He looked good in zone coverage, and he just makes sense for the scheme. I don't know if he's like if Quinn's looking for a money backer per se. I just think he's looking for a guy that he likes that fits his scheme. I don't think he gives a damn about what other people are doing. I think he's got his own scheme and he's got his own kind of mold for every position. I think he thinks Jones is a good fit.
Okay. Now, if I'm being completely honest, the Deion Jones pick is probably my least favorite pick of this past year's draft class. I don't quite get the Deion Buchanan comp. Like, I understand where you're coming from, but I do feel like one of the issues throughout this draft process with the comparisons a lot of guys were getting to Deion Buchanan, including Sua Cravens and Darren Lee and whatnot, is I do feel like people were forgetting a core part of Deion Buchanan's game when he was at Washington State, which was, he was a big-time hitter. And just because you're a tweener at safety linebacker doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to become Deion Buchanan or Thomas Davis, because both of those guys were guys that were going to destroy other human beings just by how hard they hit. So that transition to being basically a linebacker was not that big a jump for those guys. And just being a tweener that's fast and doesn't necessarily mean that you can make that similar transition. As it applies to Deion Jones, as we talked about a little bit earlier with the rugby stuff, I do feel like the Falcons sort of are thinking, okay, we're getting a guy that can be a real rangy playmaker and really help us out in coverage and in working in our zones over the middle of the defense because of his speed and his range. And that makes sense. But I also feel like the Falcons are thinking that they can sort of teach Deion Jones to be a better tackler, because I think the tackling was a legitimate weakness of his while he was at LSU. And whether or not, it's not to say that he's soft or anything like that, but I mean, you can't play in the SEC and be soft. But it is one of those things where it was an underwhelming aspect of his game. And as it translates to the NFL, I think that's going to be a bit of an obstacle for him to overcome. And I guess this is where, whether you think, tackling can be taught, I think it can. I don't necessarily know if it's something that you can teach in 4 or 5 months between the draft and the start of the regular season. But it is something I think that over time, with continued repetitions, that like any other technique, any other skill that is developed and learned at the NFL level, it can be improved upon. But it is one of those things that it may not pay real huge dividends until a couple of years down the road, like any other skill. So we'll see how it goes. As far as the Deion Buchanan comparison, I don't think it's quite there, but we'll see how it works out. Okay, our next question comes from the Dirty Bird 1998, aka Luke. He asks, "Is Alfred the future at the number 2 cornerback spot from a skill set standpoint? In my opinion, he doesn't have the length/ball skills in our scheme."
Have you watched Alfred play? He doesn't have the ball skills? What are you talking about? Maybe the length, but he's definitely got the ball skills. Although, honestly, he's got the length. He's got 33.5-inch arms. Yeah, he's 5'10", but, length is more than just height. There's 6'3" guys with 30-inch arms. There's 5'10" guys with 33-inch arms.
Yeah, it's interesting with Alfred because if you actually look at his wingspan, it's actually an inch longer than Desmond Trufant's is. I think Trufant's is 73.5 inches and Alfred's 74.5 inches. Now, you could talk about issues of, what's really the difference of an inch or so. But it is one of those things, if Alfred doesn't have the length of the ball skills, then I think Trufant doesn't technically have them either. But it doesn't really matter. Now, we've talked about this on the show before. I don't think the Falcons are going to re-sign Alfred at the end of the season, next offseason. So I don't think the answer is, I don't think he is the future at the number 2 cornerback spot, but I don't think it's going to be because of a skill set standpoint. I think it's just going to be because of a money standpoint. I think he's going to be able to command a lot more money on the open market than what the Falcons are going to be willing to pay him. So I think that's really more the issue than he doesn't have the skill set. I think you can make a much stronger argument that Alfred's skill set translates better to this defensive scheme than Trufant's does. Not to diminish Trufant, because Trufant is a very, very good cornerback. So his skill set really applies to any scheme, really. But I don't necessarily look at this scheme and say, oh, this is a perfect fit for Trufant's skill set. He's just so good that it doesn't really matter all that much. I feel like Alfred, this scheme really makes Alfred a better cornerback than it does Trufant. So I would say Alfred's more of a round peg than Trufant is from a schematic standpoint. Our next question comes from Luke again, the Dirty Bird 1998. What is Aaron's pessimistic prediction and Scott's optimistic prediction for the Falcons record?
Ooh, well, here's a fun one. I guess you could say my optimistic prediction would be, how do I put this? Damn, because I think the Falcons, I don't see why they wouldn't be able to win at least 8 games. Just looking at the schedule, I could see 8 wins. If they get a couple of balls bouncing their way, they could be a 10 to 11 win team. Absolute best, they surprise the world and everything clicks and they don't get injured and they win 12. But I think the most likely optimistic prediction is 10 wins. They make the playoffs, they sneak in as a wild card, they win 10 games.
Okay. Well, for me, my pessimistic prediction isn't my actual prediction, but if he wants me to be, more pessimistic than I normally am, because my actual prediction is I think they'll probably be like 7-9. But if I'm going to be pessimistic, then I'm going to say they're going to be a lot worse than that because everybody gets injured and, they have a season like the Chargers last year where they weren't a great team to begin with, but they were certainly a team that was playoff caliber. And just basically everybody gets hurt and then it just completely falls apart and they wind up like 4-12 or something like that. Like if you want me to be pessimistic, that's what I'll say, but that's not what I expect to happen.
I mean, if something like that happens, you might as well write Myles Garrett in as the Falcons' first overall pick next year.
Wouldn't complain about that.
Oh, you know where I stand on Myles Garrett. I would love to have him in Atlanta. I've been comparing him to John Abraham since I saw him play. Like, since the first time I saw him play. I would love to have Myles Garrett. He runs that arc just like Abraham used to.
He's good. He's very good. That's all I'll say. I'm sure we will get opportunities to talk about Myles Garrett a bunch at some point in the next, year.
I hope we don't, because that means that the Falcons are playing like shit. Because that man's going to go top 5 overall.
Fair enough.
I hope our talking about Myles Garrett is us going, man, I hope the Saints don't take him. I hope he doesn't fall to 5.
I don't know what context the conversation is going to have, but I'm pretty sure at some point we'll be talking about Myles Garrett between now and next April. So we'll find out. We got a question from Vienna Falcons again. He has thoughts on Stephen White's explanation on Vic Beasley's rookie year as being coached down by Brian Cox on the Ringer NFL podcast. What Vienna Falcons is referring to, the Ringer has an NFL podcast with Robert Mays and I think Kevin Clark. They were discussing their rankings of the top 10 interior defensive linemen and edge rushers in the league, I think last week. And during that podcast, they started talking with Stephen White, the writer for SB Nation. And he was talking about Vic Beasley. Vic Beasley came up in the conversation, and they were talking about sort of Vic Beasley not having this great rookie season. And Stephen White basically made an argument that he wasn't sure that Brian Cox was a good defensive line coach from his days in Tampa Bay, because as people may or may not know, Stephen White used to play for the Buccaneers, so that's a team that he follows closely. And he thought Vic Beasley was much more, I guess he had a much more stronger repertoire of pass rush moves while he was at Clemson, that when he, at least according to Stephen White's film study, when Vic Beasley came to Atlanta, he was basically just trying to rip and dip and not really using all the moves at his that he could, I guess. So basically, Stephen White was arguing that one of the reasons why Vic Beasley didn't have this breakout rookie year was because he was coached down by Brian Cox. So that was what was said on the podcast. So I guess now that you have the explanation, we will give our thoughts on that take.
I mean, I disagree with it. I'm just going to put that out there because most of the edge guys were being coached by Dan Quinn, not Brian Cox. Brian Cox tends to work more with the interior guys, and it would be Quinn, and then this year I believe it's going to be Smith on the exterior, the edge guys. So, yeah, we can talk shit about coaches all we want. Stephen White's going to do that because that's just what he does, but I'm not even worried about him and his thoughts on what Brian Cox did. Sometimes when you're a rookie, you're just trying to adjust to the game, and sitting there continually worrying about 8, 9, 10 different pass rush moves probably isn't the best for you. If you just go, hey, I've got 2 moves that are effective. Let me work on those now. Let me add as I get into the league. Every single rookie goes through it. Every great rookie pass rusher goes through it. DeMarcus Ware, his first year, all he did was rip. It was whether he was ripping left or ripping right. That's all he did. Early on in the season, all Vic Beasley did was spin, and it didn't help him at all. You simplify a guy's moves for his first year, year and a half, and then once he finally gets it, once he's finally got some of his strength, once he's ready to go for the league, then you start adding. I mean, hell, Dwight Freeney, all he's done his entire career has been a spin move. Every now and again, he does a dip. But his big move that he gets sacks on are spin moves. He bowls for 8 straight plays and then spins, and then boom, there's a sack. So, I mean, you can sit there and bitch about your old coach all you want. That's great. That happens. People do it. Whatever. That's all he was doing. He didn't like Brian Cox as a person, so he was about him as a coach.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have a take on this. My take is, like Stephen White, I don't really know if Brian Cox is a great defensive line coach. Like, I don't know if we've seen enough to really determine that over his tenure both in Tampa Bay as well as New York, Cleveland, and Atlanta. I don't think he's a bad coach by any means, but whether or not he's sort of the guy that can get all the talent out of most players, I don't know. But I wouldn't necessarily base that on how Vic Beasley played last year. I don't think necessarily Vic Beasley's issues last year were coaching. I think his issues were more physicality, him just not being big enough and sort of not having as much confidence in his speed to bend the edge and just beat guys with speed. I think he'll be better at that this year. So to me, my expectations are going to be that Vic Beasley takes a significant step forward this year. And if he does, then I don't think it's necessarily a feather in the hat of Brian Cox, but it is one of those things where it's like, well, at least Vic Beasley's at least on track for becoming a much better player than what he was last year. He wasn't bad last year. Let me reiterate that. He just wasn't a world beater that I think some of us built him up to be going into the year.
I can think of like 2 guys right now who I'd love to have over Brian Cox as a coach for the pass rush and the defensive line, and to work specifically with Vic Beasley. But one of them is Bill Kolar from the Broncos staff. He ain't coming here at all. The other is Gary Gibbs from the Kansas City Chiefs staff. And he sure as hell ain't coming here at all.
Yeah. I mean, like for me, I'm not one of those people that sort of really spends too much time thinking about what position coaches are doing. Like, I do feel like position coaches matter in the NFL because that's the guys that players are working with. But because you don't, unless you can actually go and watch practice and you can sit in the film room, you can't really know what's really going on with what they're doing and how they're teaching and whether or not they're properly teaching guys. So it's just one of those things where none of us sitting on the outside really have enough information to really have a strong determination one way or the other. Like, I mean, if you continually see underwhelming results on the field, then you might be able to draw some conclusions from that. But until you can look at a 3 or 4 or 5 year body of work, you can't really say anything. So let's see. It looks like we are coming up on our last question. This should be a fun one to answer. Broseph929 asks, how are we going to get Aaron a girlfriend?
We got to find a girl that actually likes salty dudes.
I mean, you know, people think they know who I am just because, you know, 90% of my tweets and 90% of my online interactions are about the Falcons, and because you know, I'm not particularly optimistic about the Falcons. People think that's what I am for the other 90% of my life, but I'm not salty in real life. It's just, you know, the Falcons aren't that good. That's, I mean, what do you want me to say? Like, if I'm going to spend 90% of my time talking about the Falcons and they're just not that great, then 90% of the stuff I'm going to say is going to sound like I'm salty, even though it's only a small portion of my life. So no one has to worry about me getting a girlfriend or anything like that. You can stop worrying about that. If that's what's on the front of your mind right now, then I guess that's just a sign that this is the dead time in the off-season calendar where people are worried about Aaron's love life as opposed to more important matters.
Yeah, I mean, it really just is an awful time of year right now. There's no football. There's no basketball. Basketball free agency is stupid because dumb shit happens, like Durant to the Warriors. Like, how's that going to help competitive balance? And then you got other stupid crap happening, like, I don't know, the baseball season and the Braves looking like total garbage. So this time of year just blows. Like, there's no football, there's no baseball. Basketball sucks because it's all free agency. Hockey, this is the South. I don't think we believe in hockey down here. So there you go. Like, there's really nothing to do. Like, I'm sitting here watching wrestling most Monday nights.
There you go. Well, folks, that's how we'll end the show, I guess, this week. So if you guys want to get your mailbag questions answered for next week's show, use the hashtag Falcons Mailbag. You can tweet at myself. I am at FalcFans on Twitter. Scott is at Karasik S. You can also tweet at the show at Falcons PFC. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast feed on iTunes and any other platforms that you can find podcasts on. You can check out our stuff at profootballcentral.com, as well as several other sports podcasts if you need to get your football fix and don't care whether it's about the Falcons or the Lions or the Patriots. You can go check that out at profootballcentral.com. And I think we'll be off next week, right, Scott? And then we'll come back to discuss the offensive line and anything that happens later on, I think.
Well, next week I actually have a work meeting, so it's going to be the week after.
Yeah. So that's what I was saying. Like, we'll be off next week. You know, we've been off a lot recently, but again, as Scott just said, you're not really missing much unless you guys have some more Demi Lovato stories that you want to talk about. But yeah, so check us out in 2 weeks. We'll be talking about the offensive line and catching up on any Falcons news and answering your mailbag questions. So we'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
Yep. And then just a note, after the offensive line, it's defensive front seven, Then we'll do the secondary and special teams, and we'll be done with the series after that. So 3 more weeks of previews, and then we actually will have real football to talk about.
Yep.
Thank God.
There you go. All right, looking forward to that.
So everybody have a great week.